Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's Talk Consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Toy, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty good today. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good today, too. Thanks for asking. And we want to thank you all for tuning in. Today on The Voice of Yoga, we will talk about more of the changes taking place in the infrastructure of the Kriya Yoga program as a result of a deeper understanding of spiritual law. Listen as we explain the third revision by introducing the function of union with the divine. Divine presence is all, and total consciousness is awareness of this divine presence. All the good, beautiful, and true attributes belong to the divine. Anything that does not have the good qualities of the divine is simply a lack of awareness of divine presence. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. We are talking consciousness. Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and experience total awareness of divine perfection. Swami, it sounds like we got a lot to talk about today. So what is the changes taking place in the Kriya Yoga program based on this deeper understanding of spiritual law?
Yeah, what we're doing here is we're trying to update the spiritual science of Kriya Yoga and make it a demonstrable spiritual science so that we can actually start to demonstrate the presence of divine law with scientific certainty. And what that means is to be able to heal the sick, reform the sinner, raise the dead, is really the message of the Christ in the Bible. And so the more we work on understanding spiritual law, the more that we start to see that this isn't out of our reach anymore, that we can actually start to demonstrate these principles.
Well, how does that change, say we're in an asana class?
Well, we're changing the internal mental work that would incorporate the physical posture. The procedure and the intention of the physical exercise hasn't changed. But what is changing is the internal mental work. And so today's show, we're talking about union with the divine, revision 3. And to really understand that yoga means union with the divine. Your first stage of yoga, your fifth yama, is brahmacharya, which translates into carrier of Brahman. And Brahman is the Hindu word for this divine presence. And so for us to internalize the divine is really the intention of your yoga practice. But also what we want to understand is, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to move beyond sense-level living into this spiritual understanding? And the main reason is that it's an upgrade. That when spirit is cause, creation is perfect. And for most of what we were doing prior to this was we were trying to do it mentally with positive thinking. We would use our minds to actually turn to this divine presence, this invisible, intangible source of sustenance, and we would just grasp from it a new thought about what it was that we were experiencing, maybe as a symptom in our physical body. And then we would try with human will to try and internalize that image in the body to affect the change. Now, that comes under what we now call the old theology, because now we understand that even if you do that, you can get a certain degree of benefit from it, but all you're going to do is change finite bad to finite good. But it's still finite. And the goal of yoga was total consciousness. It was liberation and enlightenment. And what this means is that we must rise above the law of karma. Karma is what turns finite bad to finite good and back to finite bad, because it is the belief in two powers. And so now we want to get out of the rational and into the absolute, which is where our liberation is found. But in order to do that, we must make this union with the divine. And it's not just a personal declaration. It's a state of being at one with this divine principle.
So we're really not making these changes just in the asana program. We're talking about all facets and departments of our lives.
Oh, absolutely. That you will change your level of consciousness. And as a result of that, you will be living out from the perfection of being. And that's the first thing that I started to notice was spirit can't be divided. You can't employ it to one aspect and not all. Spirit is the absolute.
Now, I understand what you're saying, that spirit is the absolute. In the summary, we said all the good, beautiful, and true attributes belong to the divine. So my question with that is, I know in the past we have been talking about judgment. So if we judge something to be good or beautiful, wouldn't that still put us into what you're calling the law of karma?
Right. And as we have started to explain, that type of judgment falls under the heading of human thinking. That our ability to form thoughts and opinions and establish beliefs is really a belief in this two powers. From that perspective, we do make these judgments that this is good and this is bad, and we move towards what we think is good and we move away from what we think is bad. But now what we're learning is that we must forsake all human thinking for divine knowing. That we want to know the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And it starts with the principle that all is spirit, and spirit is absolute goodness. So it's not the goodness that we as a human being think it is. There's a big difference between absolute goodness and finite good. And so these are some of the changes that we're starting to implement in our program, is actually learning the modes of thinking and then how to forsake human thinking for divine knowing.
Just to clarify, so in the absolute, in that way of thinking, divine thinking, there is no bad and there is no good. Everything just is.
Right. When you are looking at it through a human mind, it must appear as good.
So sorry to ask for more clarification. So it's okay to think that something is good if it comes from a divine way of thinking. But we may think we're thinking divinely, but we're not. We're thinking humanly.
Right. And that's basically what we've started to say. Like when you're examining your physical body, and say, for example, you find pain, discomfort, or instability in your physical body. Before, we would take that it was something that we wanted to change. Now, we just use that as a barometer to give us a clue as to how I'm thinking. That's where we start to make our change. Now, there is no lack for divine presence. That the perfection of being is all that there is. Now, if you're finding defect, imperfection in your experience, then all you have to do is you have to change how you're perceiving what is before you. You have to change how you're thinking. And in the framework of doing this, what we are starting to learn is that this concept of forsaking human thinking for divine knowing is the quantum leap. Because when divine mind takes over the scientific government of your body, then that is what we would say you are thinking right.
So if I find a discomfort anywhere in my body, whatever that might be, then do I want to acknowledge it or at least be aware of it and then say to myself, okay, there's something in my consciousness that is not parallel with the divine way of thinking.
Right. If you have this condition, then what you have to understand is that you have a belief in something other than the perfection of being, other than the presence of the one divine life. And so that's where you want to focus your attention, is changing how you're thinking.
All right, so I recognize this condition and I know I have to change how I'm thinking. So do I just turn my thoughts and my mind towards what I consider to be my divinity?
Right. And I really like what the Bible tells us. It tells us to be still and know that I am God. Now, if you drill down with this instructions, it's really a two-part command. Part A is to be still, and part B is to know. And to make union with the divine, to open the channel of awareness to this divine presence, we must imitate it by being still. Also, to know this truth, which is to assume spiritual identity. We really have to know ourselves in the way that we're created, in the image and likeness of the divine, which is spirit. So in the framework of being able to open the channels of communication between the individual and this one divine presence, these are some of the things that we have to put in place. Part of it is changing a little bit of what it is that we were teaching prior. The first thing you have to know is that you are spirit, that you are not a physical body that has a mind and perchance a soul. That when you know the truth of your being, that your spirit, which is perfect, harmonious, whole, peaceful, and well, then you have a better foundation to work with. Because that was what we have been talking about. There's a difference between sowing to the flesh and sowing to the spirit. Sowing to the flesh, in the Bible tells you, is death. To sow to the spirit is life. And so, of course, we need to forsake our sense-level living for this spiritual knowing.
So what can you tell us what it means to be spiritual?
Yeah, what are the characteristics of the human that is in spiritual identity? Now, I think probably the first thing that you want to understand is that there will be no fear. If you are an eternal spiritual being, the concept of death is removed from the equation. And physical identity, identification with a form, is all about fear. Because the simple reason is that it is a false sense of existence that totally relies on belief for its existence at all. We're under the assumption that we think that we have a physical body that needs to be protected. And so, for the most part, we're really defending the wrong self. When you assume spiritual identity, there's no longer any fear.
Well, this is a good place to pause to hear a word from our sponsors. So listeners, we'll be back with you in just a few moments. Kriya Yoga Theory 2 is a unique and revolutionary practice and forum designed to facilitate the growth process in human development. Apotheosis is a real experience and has an evidence procedure. You cannot lead someone to permanent change by doing for them what they must do themselves. Personal accountability and responsibility are the foundation of Kriya Yoga Theory 2. You must be engaged and devoted. Prana power brings virtue to overcome fear, wisdom to overcome ignorance, purpose to overcome selfishness, enthusiasm to overcome laziness. Kriya Yoga is a path of action, knowledge, and devotion. These sessions are a celestial positioning system to guide the individual into union with the divine. For more information or to sign up for your next session online, go to www.ipdtransform.com. Namaste. Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. So, Swami, I want to move forward in some of the notes that we have for the show today, and one of them is a reading that you have written down from C.S. Lewis. Wondering if this would be a good time for that.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis wrote, "Perfect love, we know, casts out fear, but so do other things, ignorance, alcohol, passion, presumption, and stupidity. It is very desirable that we should all advance to that perfection of love in which we shall fear no longer. But it is very undesirable until we have reached that stage that we should allow any inferior agent to cast out fear." Right? Because I think most of us would be very happy if we could just get more of the pleasures and profits of the human experience. And we'd be very content to live at this sense level understanding of ourselves. But in order to really experience the truth and liberation from this law of karma, we really can't get off at an earlier stop, I think is what he's saying. Like if we start to use things like alcohol and stupidity and ignorance to help manage our fear, which is a big thing, I think, today. Everybody's talking about stress management. And so we manage our condition, and we're using things like the availability of our next breath to calm down the fears. But these fears are all part of a false sense of existence to begin with. And we're trying to make sense out of something that isn't there at all. What we're starting to learn is that this divine law, this divine presence, is really the most pragmatic form of management that you could possibly find. That to assume spiritual identity offers you solution to any common problem that you're trying to overcome.
Well, I think it's very interesting because just recently I was listening to a lecture by Herb Fitch, and he was talking about even when we worry, we are not in the eye of our being. We are not spiritual. And he said, for example, when a mother worries that her daughter is not home yet and it's after midnight, or your son was drafted, and this type of worry is, well, to me, I think he was saying that it was another form of fear.
Well, absolutely. But it's also a violation to spiritual law. It's a violation to the first commandment, that we have a belief in something other than the allness of spirit. And we also have a misunderstanding of what we think spirit is. Because if spirit is absolute love, absolute goodness, then there is no evil. There is nothing to worry about.
Kind of reminds me of that saying that became very popular, don't worry, be happy.
I think what we're trying to do here is not worry, like C.S. Lewis said, because I'm ignorant or I'm in denial of the testimony of my senses, or I'm anesthetized of my senses, or I'm enraged with passion or presumption or stupidity, but that we know the truth, that we abide in this spiritual law, this invisible, intangible, sustaining infinite. That's what I call senseless optimism.
I think one of the most important parts of that reading that you just told us was the very first 4 words, and that's perfect love, we know. And then it says cast out fear. So my question to you is, in your words, what is perfect love? What does that mean?
Well, love is also another word for divine, for spirit, for this eternal life, the principle of this universe. And so perfect love, divine presence, in the presence of the allness of spirit, there is no fear. But if we are sowing to the flesh, and if we are looking at things from a divided consciousness, and we have this belief in a life that expires, then of course we're riddled with fear. But this revelation that perfect love, the presence of the divine, is all that there is, and I am divine reflection, that I am in union with this indestructible principle, then you can't have fear.
And that's why I thought it was important that it was perfect love, and then it says we know, because we've been talking a lot about knowing ourselves and the way that we are created.
And knowing the truth
right.
of our being. That we are spirit, eternal, forever held, controlled, and governed by this divine law. But in order for us to activate it, we must be conscious of its presence. And that's why this union with the divine is so important. And it's also important to know that the connection is found in the thought unity that exists between divine mind and what Mary Baker Eddy called the real man. In order to open the channels of communication, we must, as you said, we must know ourselves in the way that we are created, or known by the Creator, which is spirit. Beyond physical, beyond mental, is the spiritual truth of being. And we must be able to connect to that within ourselves.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about knowing the spirit. And we have talked about this before in other shows about the mystical marriage of the Lamb. And just wondering if we could maybe drill down with that a little bit.
Yeah, the mystical marriage of the Lamb is the unity between the principle and its idea, which is God and man. And I like what Herb Fitch says in the Revelation of St. John, those who through some innate incapacity to open themselves to the absolute find that they are now besieged. Their unwillingness to surrender personal sense, personal individuality, personal will, personal desire, their own false sense of physicality, all this mitigates against the power of spirit, which is saying, my will be done.
It kind of reminds me of the story about the rich man that came to Jesus, and this man wanted to follow Jesus, and he said something to the effect of, you must relinquish all of your possessions. And then he ran off, and that was not something that he wanted to do. He was afraid.
Right, but it was also much more than just his things. It was all of his concepts and beliefs that most of us are really imprisoned by. And when you really start to understand what this term to think differently really means, and just how far it goes, because we must give up sense-level living and start to understand ourselves as eternal spiritual beings. While you are in this physical appearance, to really start to live out from that perfection of being is optimal.
I mean, there are so many things that we are conditioned with. I mean, if you think about it, our parents, unbeknownst to themselves, I mean, we started celebrating birthdays when we turned 1, 2, 3. And so we've already began our lives knowing that we are aging, that we're older, and that kind of puts us into this mortal way of thinking.
Right. And that's what we call now the old theology. That's the way we used to think. And now as we start to understand that there is a spiritual law, that there is a level of living that is far beyond the senses, that we can actually abide in now and benefit from it enormously. Because when you are living out from the perfection of being and you are under the jurisdiction of divine law, you live by grace, which means that everything is provided for you. But you can't do that if you cling to this personal identity, if you cling to a physical body.
Yeah, I find that very interesting that we have to change how we think about our aging and then understand that there is no number associated with us as far as years go because we are eternal. And that can be a tough pill for us to swallow because we see aging all around us.
Right. But isn't that what Mary Baker Eddy said, that mortal mind sees what it believes as certainly as it believes what it sees. And this is the type of thinking, the human thinking, that we want to start to forsake. We really want to start to move beyond sense-level living and start to live out from divine mind, from the absolute, the presence of eternal life, right here, right now.
And I just love this quote that you have from Herb Fitch. Think of the miracle that awaits us as we come into the realization of a force within us which eliminates death.
Right. And only through the indwelling spirit can we know this truth. And so there is something that we must do, and this union with the divine that we're talking about is exactly what is required of us. To be able to activate the presence of this divine law in our experience is to acknowledge it. But for most of us, we don't know what that is or what it would look like if we were doing it. Here's some quotations that I have here that might be helpful. There's one here from Joel Goldsmith who says, "No statement of truth is God power. No thought of truth is God power. Only God is God power." And there's another one here that Mary Baker Eddy wrote, which is, "To think with God as God shows us the perfection of the body."
And with that, I think it's time to start closing down our program for today. So listeners, be sure to visit the website, www.ipdtransform.com. There's a lot of tools on that website that you can click to further your spiritual developments. If you want to access more of the Blog Talk Radio shows, 3/4 of the way down the homepage, you'll see a section entitled Swami Says Recent Posts, and you'll see some listed there that you can click. Also, don't forget, under Online Classes tab, you can access Swami's free webinar, which is at Wednesdays at noon. Swami, have any other final thoughts about today's program?
I would like to encourage everybody to make this union with the divine, the invisible, intangible, sustaining infinite, and to identify totally with it. And with that, I'll wish everybody a good day. Namaste.
Thank you for listening to our program, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton, along with Swami Jayananda, signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga kind of day. Namaste.